Hey everyone, welcome back to Echo Barrel. Today, we're diving into one of the most important and complicated questions of our time. Why did Russia invade Ukraine? It's not just about tanks and troops. This story stretches back decades and involves geopolitics, history, identity, and power. From the Cold War to Crimea, from NATO to nationalism. This is a story filled with tension, fear, hope, and resilience. So, grab your coffee or tea, and let's break it all down together in a way that actually makes sense. In full detail, across every angle, in a journey that will take us through the heart of post-Cold War history and into the trenches of the 2022 invasion. This will be a long ride, but by the end of it, you'll understand this conflict like few do. Let's rewind to 1991. The Soviet Union collapses, and Ukraine becomes an independent country for the first time in modern history. It was a big deal. Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, major industrial centers, fertile farmland, and a strategic position between East and West. The story of Ukraine's independence is often told in terms of its nuclear disarmament. In 1994, under the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine agreed to give up its nukes in exchange for security assurances from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. The idea was simple. Ukraine gives up nuclear weapons, and in return, its sovereignty is respected. But as we'll see later, that promise didn't hold. Meanwhile, in Russia, the 1990s were turbulent. Hyperinflation, corruption, oligarchs rising, and a massive identity crisis. Russians felt humiliated. Their empire was gone. Their economy was in shambles. National pride had taken a massive hit. Enter Vladimir Putin. A former KGB officer who came to power in 1999, he positioned himself as a strongman who would restore order and greatness. He wanted to reassert Russia's influence, not necessarily through open empire building, but through economic pressure, political manipulation, and, eventually, military force. To understand Putin's mindset, think of a man obsessed with control, legacy, and narrative. He sees the West as hostile and Ukraine as the heart of the Russian soul. To lose Ukraine completely to the West, unacceptable. Then came NATO. In the 1990s and early 2000s, several Eastern European nations joined NATO: Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and later the Baltic states. From Moscow's perspective, this looked like a betrayal of earlier promises and a slow-motion military encirclement. Even though Ukraine wasn't a NATO member, the growing partnership, military drills, and open aspirations toward the West created alarm bells in Moscow. Putin saw this as a creeping threat to Russian influence. Let's fast forward to 2004. Ukraine was preparing for a presidential election that would become a turning point. The country was deeply divided. Western regions leaned toward Europe, while Eastern and Southern regions favored closer ties with Russia. In the November 2004 runoff, pro-Russian candidate Viktor Yanukovych was declared the winner over pro-Western reformist Viktor Yushchenko. However, international observers, including the OSCE, documented widespread electoral fraud. Exit polls showed Yushchenko had won by 11%, but official results declared Yanukovych the victor. Massive protests erupted. Known as the Orange Revolution, these demonstrations began in Kiev's Maidan Nezalezhnosti and quickly spread nationwide. Over 1 million Ukrainians peacefully protested in sub-zero temperatures, calling for fair elections and an end to corruption. On December 3, 2004, Ukraine's Supreme Court annulled the results and ordered a new runoff. On December 26, Viktor Yushchenko won with 52% of the vote. His victory was not just electoral. It was symbolic of Ukraine's push toward the European Union and democratic governance. But challenges lay ahead. In September 2005, Yushchenko dismissed his own government amid internal disputes. Economic reforms were slow, corruption remained widespread, and infighting with his former ally Yulia Tymoshenko weakened his presidency. In 2010, Yanukovych returned and won the presidency with 49% of the vote. He promised balance between Russia and the West, but gradually shifted Ukraine closer to Moscow. He imprisoned Yulia Tymoshenko in 2011 on controversial charges, a move widely condemned by the EU and seen as politically motivated. This set the stage for the next seismic shift. On November 21, 2013, Just days before signing a long-anticipated association agreement with the European Union, President Yanukovych abruptly suspended talks and instead accepted a $15 billion aid package from Russia. That night, students and activists gathered at Maidan Square in Kiev. Within days, thousands joined them, demanding EU integration and condemning Yanukovych's decision. The protests became known as Euromaidan. By late January 2014, violence escalated. On February 18th to 20th, over 100 protesters were killed by security forces in Kiev in what became known as the Heavenly Hundred Massacre. International condemnation was swift. On February 22, 2014, Yanukovych fled the capital. Parliament declared him unfit for office by a vote of 328 to 0. An interim government was established and new elections scheduled. Putin denounced the events as a Western-backed coup and moved quickly. On February 27, 2014, massed troops without insignia seized key buildings in Crimea. These were later confirmed by Putin to be Russian soldiers. On March 16, Russia organized a referendum in Crimea under military occupation. Official results claimed 97% voted to join Russia, but the vote was boycotted by most Crimean Tatars and ethnic Ukrainians. The international community, including the UN General Assembly, declared the referendum invalid. On March 18th, Russia formally annexed Crimea. It was the first time since World War II that European borders had been redrawn by force. Soon after, pro-Russian militants seized government buildings in Donetsk and Luhansk. Armed groups declared people's republics and held sham referendums. Russia denied involvement, but intelligence and on-the-ground evidence revealed a steady flow of weapons, fighters, and advisors from across the border. Ukraine responded with anti-terrorist operations, sparking a war in the Donbas. Between 2014 and 2021, over 14,000 people were killed and more than 1.5 million displaced. By the end of 2021, satellite images and intelligence reports showed that Russia had deployed over 190,000 troops near Ukraine's borders, including forces in Crimea and Belarus. US and NATO intelligence publicly warned of an imminent invasion, but skepticism remained among many observers and even some Ukrainian officials. On February 21st, 2022, Vladimir Putin recognized the independence of the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. Russian troops, under the pretext of peacekeeping, entered these territories. Then, in the early hours of February 24th, 2022, Putin announced a special military operation. Minutes later, missile strikes targeted Ukrainian military facilities, airports, and major cities, including Kiev, Kharkiv, and Odessa. Simultaneously, ground forces launched a full-scale invasion from the north via Belarus, east from Russia and Donbas, and south from Crimea. Putin claimed the goals were to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, widely discredited as false pretexts, to protect Russian-speaking populations, to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, to bring Ukraine into Russia's sphere of influence. However, the Kremlin had vastly underestimated Ukrainian resistance. President Volodymyr Zelensky refused to evacuate Kiev, famously responding to Western offers of extraction with, "I need ammunition, not a ride." The Ukrainian armed forces, bolstered by years of NATO training and home field advantage, mounted an unexpectedly strong defense. Anti-tank weapons such as US-made javelins and British laws decimated Russian armored columns. Turkish Bayraktar drones played a key role in early stages of the defense. By March 2022, Russia's advances had stalled. Logistical failures, poor morale, and fierce Ukrainian resistance forced a strategic withdrawal from northern Ukraine. The Battle of Kiev, which Russia had expected to win in days, ended in Russian retreat by early April. In response to the invasion, the West imposed sweeping sanctions. Over $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves were frozen. Major Russian banks were removed from the SWIFT system. Hundreds of foreign companies, including McDonald's, Apple, and Shell, exited Russia. Export controls targeted Russia's tech and defense sectors. The U.S. alone committed over $75 billion in military and financial aid to Ukraine by late 2023, including HIMARS rocket systems, Patriot air defense, and advanced artillery. On the battlefield, Ukraine launched successful counteroffensives. In September 2022, Ukrainian forces recaptured Kharkiv Oblast, regaining over 6,000 square kilometers in 1 week. In November 2022, Russia withdrew from Kherson, the only regional capital it had captured. Still, Russia responded by targeting Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. Waves of missile and drone attacks disabled power grids and water supplies during the winter of 2022 to 23. Iranian-made Shahed-136 drones became a key tool in Russia's terror campaign. As of 2024, the front lines have hardened, but daily artillery exchanges, drone strikes, and trench warfare continue along a front spanning over 1,000 kilometers. Estimates suggest over 500,000 total casualties, including 70,000 plus Ukrainian military deaths and 300,000 plus Russian losses, killed and wounded. 8 million Ukrainian refugees abroad. War-related global economic damage exceeding $1 trillion, including energy shocks and disrupted grain exports. Ukraine's will to resist remains strong. Russia's goals remain elusive. The full-scale invasion has become Europe's most destructive conflict since World War II, and there's no clear end in sight. The world reacted swiftly and decisively to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. On February 24, 2022, the same day Russian tanks crossed the border, the United Nations convened an Emergency Security Council meeting. Although Russia vetoed condemnation, 141 countries in the Union General Assembly later voted to demand Russia withdraw from Ukraine. Western nations imposed sweeping economic sanctions that targeted every sector of the Russian economy. The US, EU, UK, Canada, and Japan froze Russian central bank assets totaling over $300 billion. Major Russian banks, including Sberbank and VTB, were cut off from the SWIFT international payment system. Tech companies such as Apple, Microsoft, and Intel suspended operations in Russia. Oil majors like Shell and BP pulled out, and Russian oil was banned or heavily restricted in the US and Europe. Militarily, NATO reinforced its eastern flank. Over 40,000 troops were placed on heightened alert across member states bordering Russia and Ukraine. The alliance established 4 new battle groups in Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. A major shift came from Germany, long reliant on Russian gas. Berlin suspended Nord Stream 2, committed to reaching NATO's 2% defense spending goal, and sent lethal aid to Ukraine for the first time since World War II. The EU, traditionally less unified on defense, approved 18 billion euros in macro-financial assistance to Ukraine and welcomed over 4 million Ukrainian refugees within the first 6 months of the war. The toll of the war has been catastrophic. By early 2024, over 500,000 people have been killed or wounded, military and civilian. Civilian deaths, as tracked by the UN, exceeded 30,000. With many more unconfirmed in occupied regions. 8 million Ukrainians fled abroad, making it the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. Cities like Mariupol, Bakhmut, and Severodonetsk were almost completely destroyed. War crimes allegations mounted. The massacre in Bucha, where over 400 civilians were found dead, prompted investigations by the International Criminal Court. Thousands of Ukrainian children were forcibly deported to Russia. UNICEF and other agencies have documented forced transfers, raising charges of genocide. Russia's use of thermobaric weapons, cluster munitions, and deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure were widely condemned as violations of the Geneva Conventions. Humanitarian agencies, including the ICRC and Doctors Without Borders, have operated in dangerous zones to aid the wounded and evacuate civilians. The war is not just about land, it's about identity. Vladimir Putin's rhetoric has painted Ukraine as a non-country, a Western puppet created to undermine Russian unity. In a now infamous July 2021 essay, Putin claimed Russians and Ukrainians are one people. This historical revisionism aimed to justify the erasure of Ukraine's sovereignty. Russian state media portrayed the invasion as a noble crusade against Western decadence and NATO expansion. Dissent within Russia was crushed. Over 20,000 protesters were arrested in the first 2 months alone. Independent media like TV Rain and Novaya Gazeta were forced to shut down. In contrast, the invasion forged an even stronger Ukrainian identity. Surveys show 91% of Ukrainians now consider Russia an enemy, up from 29% in 2018. Partisan movements emerged in occupied areas, and civilians flew Ukrainian flags in defiance. Ukrainian language usage surged. The Orthodox Church of Ukraine cut its final ties to Moscow. The war turned what was once a divided country into a unified nation resisting imperial aggression. The war sent economic ripples across the globe. Ukraine and Russia together account for 30% of global wheat exports. The blockade of Ukrainian ports caused spikes in food prices and severe shortages in the Middle East and Africa. The 2022 global food crisis threatened over 345 million people with acute hunger, according to the WFP. Energy prices soared. Brent crude spiked above $120 per barrel in March 2022. European gas prices hit record highs. To counteract the shocks, the UN and Turkey brokered the Black Sea Grain Initiative in July 2022, allowing some exports to resume. The EU accelerated plans to cut dependence on Russian fossil fuels. By 2023, Russian gas exports to Europe had dropped by over 80%. Global inflation rose, central banks hiked interest rates, and the IMF downgraded growth projections worldwide. As of 2024, the war remains ongoing. Neither side has achieved a decisive breakthrough. Russia controls roughly 17% of Ukrainian territory, including parts of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Crimea. Ukraine maintains morale and continues receiving Western arms, but the pace has slowed as donor fatigue and political divides grow. Talks of peace remain distant. Ukraine demands full territorial restoration. Russia insists on retaining gains. Proposals for frozen conflict, like in Transnistria or South Ossetia, are unpopular in Kiev. Nuclear rhetoric has escalated. Putin suspended Russia's participation in New START, raised the readiness of strategic forces, and deployed tactical nukes to Belarus in 2023. Still, no actual nuclear use has occurred. Analysts now debate whether this war is a generational conflict. With elections looming in the US and EU, and China watching closely, the future of the conflict could hinge on geopolitics far beyond Ukraine's borders. This is not just a regional war. It's a war about rules, sovereignty, power, and the future of global order. Ukraine fights not only for its own survival, but for a vision of democracy, self-determination, and resistance to authoritarianism. Russia, under Putin, has chosen a path of imperial revival and ideological confrontation. The outcome of this war will shape the 21st century. Whether it ends with negotiation, collapse, or escalation, it has already rewritten the geopolitics of Europe. Thank you for watching Echo Barrel. If you found this video insightful, please like, share, and subscribe to support our mission of bringing history's turning points to life. Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.